Hi, we're here at Anthology New and Used Books in downtown Scranton for our second episode of Dinner and a Book, where we read a book and discuss it, and Chef Jeff Diaz prepares a meal that ties into the book. I'm Andrea. This is Cheryl.
Hi, I'm Arnene.
I am Mari.
And I'm Tina.
And this is Chef Jeff. Chef, do you want to tell us about what you've prepared for us today?
Absolutely. Today we're serving just two courses, some sushi and some fresh fruit that ties into well with the tradition of Chinese culture.
Okay. Today's book that we're discussing is The Last Chinese Chef by Nicole Mons, and I think this is her second or third novel. She's a food writer, actually, first and foremost, and she's written several novels, but she's a food writer first and foremost, and a bit of an expert on Asian food, and especially Asian food tied into Asian culture. So let's start with the basics. Who liked it?
Well, I'd like to start with the basics. There's so much hidden language in the Chinese preparation of food, serving, as well as eating. And actually, there's a lot of importance to where everybody is seated at the table. Now, from what I've read, they said that if whoever is seated facing the door, they are the highest people that are there. If you're seated, your back is facing the door, you're the lowest. So where may I ask is the door, Andrea?
Behind all of us?
All of us. We are the lowly literati of Scranton.
That's okay. I'll take that.
The lowly literati. Well, at least we're literati.
True, whether it's lowly or
Otherwise, yeah.
So now there's really two elements to the story. There's the food writing part of it, in that she's translating the book that she actually fictionally wrote called The Last Chinese Chef. And then there's the modern story of the woman who goes to China and meets the Chinese chef who's translating it. You really have the modern story and the historical bit of the story. Which of you liked which part?
I didn't like any.
I loved it.
I know
All
you
of
did.
it. Every morsel.
I thought it was well done, well constructed. She's a good writer, but
I didn't think so, but go ahead. Keep going.
Okay.
Keep going.
it was. I like to read my books and eat my food. This was so food obsessive that it threw me, and I thought the plot was weak at best.
Wow.
I'm a self-proclaimed foodie, so I loved all of the stuff about the food. I loved the whole stepping back into the culture, generations, that whole idea of the Chinese emperor and that secret city and all of that stuff is so foreign to, our Western ideas and just fascinating. But I loved the food, and I liked the relationship between the food and her. I agree with Arnene. I don't think it was that well constructed.
I didn't think it was well written at all. The classic, novel writing 101 is show me, don't tell me. Well, half of the story she told us, was kind of like, I felt like she was double parked, like I've got to get this out. So there were a lot of things that I thought she could have expanded or could have presented in a different way. So I didn't like, I didn't care for the writing at all.
Well, there's so much that she needs to divulge to us. There's so much culture here. There is so much history in this food that there's so much educating that needs to be done, that I feel, as you say, she felt like she was double parked, but there was so much to get out that you kind of had to say so much to portray everything that you wanted to try to let you understand the behind the cooking and the cuisine.
Speaking of the cooking, let's
try
some of Jeff's. Let's
tell
try
us
the
what we've
sushi.
got here.
Yes,
You
please.
have some sushi, some of you have some lobster, salmon, some eel, and some tuna. Yeah, then you have a sweet and sour chili sauce with that over wild greens. And some seaweed or something. So you should try that out.
Gorgeous. Can you
Which one
get
is
this?
this?
That's the tuna right there.
And this is
And the
is this
swordfish, I'm sorry. That's swordfish and that's the tuna.
And what's
This is the tuna.
That will be your eel.
Okay.
It won't bite you.
Okay.
Okay, so I have
If it
eel
does, drink your
and
sake and it
Salmon.
tastes much better.
eel
Tell
and
us
salmon.
about the sake. The sake is wonderful.
Yeah, the sake, you'll have a nice, clean, smooth finish with it. You definitely don't want to, when you go to a liquor store and buy it, you don't want to buy it under the beverage section because it won't be the real thing. So you got to be pretty cautious as to when you buy the sake. But it has fermented from rice, and it has not the strong flavor you typically would get from grapes. It's not a grape beverage.
It's got a lightness that is so different.
Correct.
It's really crisp,
Right.
actually.
And it's not Chinese. I mean, it's a Japanese beverage more than anything, but I thought that would pair well with our first course.
It's Asian cuisine.
Right, it is Asian cuisine.
Asian
So that was
cuisine.
Absolutely.
Do,
To-
do
to
they
me,
do
it's-
sushi in China? I don't know.
Only in sushi restaurants.
This is fantastic.
I hadn't heard her mention anything about sushi though. Did
Ginger?
you notice
Sure.
that anywhere in the book?
Well, no, but she didn't mention pizza, and I'm sure they have that.
That's true.
It was
me,
so intense
her
about
writing-
the food.
She writes to me like a screenwriter.
That makes sense.
Because her second book, Lost in Translation, became a very, very famous movie, which I also found incredibly boring.
I love that movie. She really writes a lot about the tying in of Asian culture with American culture, and I think that's kind of at the heart of this book. Is a Western writer who writes about food, and I think she even says not even the fancy stuff. She writes about everyday restaurants that people in America eat, and then she goes to study the Chinese culture and the food and how historical and culturally tied it is, and how foreign that is to someone.
And the food she writes about here is food that was served to the emperor.
Yes, yes.
This is she's following, well, the gentleman that she becomes connected with in China is connected to a whole family and extended group who cooked for the emperor. So this is a not Chinese food that anyone outside of the imperial city would ever have tasted.
Correct.
This
In fact, they weren't allowed to eat
No,
most of
absolutely not.
this food.
This is-
Yes,
It was-
under the communist regime.
That's
correct?
true, yes.
That's another aspect that I found fascinating, was just the whole idea. And I don't know if you didn't know a lot about the Cultural Revolution in China, if you would even get that. The Cultural Revolution is oddly named. It was an anti-cultural revolution. It was an attempt to destroy.
I like
All
the
of it.
philosophy of food. The uncles, the three uncles who are tutoring Sam, talk about food and what its meaning, and I just like the fact that they say never cook food just to be eaten. There's this whole social part of food. Food is not meant to be eaten alone. I like that very much. I like, so here we are, we're bonding.
Relational,
over-
right,
So the food is
relationship.
all about the relationship, and so I love that. That was the part of the book that I did like, was the learning about the Chinese perception of food and the way it's supposed to be eaten, and the meaning behind everything that you eat. So I did like that part.
There's a great passage on the very first page. The story goes back and forth between the translation of The Last Chinese Chef book and then the modern story. And from The Last Chinese Chef, it says, "Apprentices have asked me, what is the most exalted peak of cuisine? Is it the freshest ingredients, the most complex flavors? Is it the rustic or the rare? It is none of these. The peak is neither eating nor cooking, but the giving and sharing of food. Great food should never be taken alone. What pleasure can a man take in fine cuisine unless he invites cherished friends, counts the days until the banquet, and composes an anticipatory poem for his letter of invitation?" So I thought that was stunning. I think the
wonderful.
strongest writing in the book is
That writing,
the
absolutely.
Last Chinese Chef.
It crosses over almost into the poetic, I think.
Which is what they say the food actually is poetry,
Yeah.
and that it's the food that inspires the poets and the literati. It's not vice versa, but it is the food that actually is the inspiration. And one part that I'll read that I found a wonderful place that I would love to go visit now that I've read the book, and it really spoke to me getting on the subject of the literati. Then there is Hangzhou. Once came the cuisine of the literati. This is food that takes poetry as its principal inspiration. From commemorating great poems of the past to dining on candlelit barges afloat upon West Lake, where wine is drunk and new poems are created. Hangzhou cuisine strives always to delight men of letters. The aesthetic symmetry between food and literature is a pattern without end. Again, everything goes back to the food is what ignites the creation.
I highlighted the same bit of text, the exact same lines in mine.
It's so good. That's so good.
I think that's where the strong points of the book were the cultural relativity of the food, because when she goes into the story is about a woman who's been recently widowed, Maggie, who's going to Beijing because she learns that her recently deceased husband may have fathered a child, and so that's what brings her to China in the first place. And I think for me, the story part was the weakest part of the whole book. I think the cultural revelations were more interesting to me than the actual story.
I think that plot line was so predictable. You know, it was predictable to me.
Oh, absolutely.
I did think that she, as a writer, was rather skillful in getting us, though, inside of Maggie's grief, though. It was different from a lot of treatment of grief, that kind of grief. Because she's grieving the loss of her husband, and then this revelation comes. And I just like the way she did that. I think the character, the gentleman she meets in China, I think was kind of a flat character for
Sam?
sure.
Very.
Sam.
Yes.
Yeah, thank you. His name just wasn't.
Did you read The Pilot's Wife by Anita Shreve? It's the same idea. You know, man dies unexpectedly. Unexpectedly, they find out the man had a child, not
He had
by
another
his
family.
wife.
He had a whole other family, not just a child.
Right. So, I didn't find that original.
I thought the first few pages really drew you in, though. I mean, I loved it. Like, within the matter of 3 pages, it was like, oh, you know, you're finding out she's grieving over her husband. Then all of a sudden, you know, she gets a phone call, and here he may have a child in China. And just the way it was written, and the fact of her selling her home, and she goes to live on a boat. I mean, she really
That was
isolates
weird.
herself.
Yeah,
she
her
really
world
wants,
shrinks.
yes, she
It's
really
smaller and smaller
goes
and
within
smaller.
herself.
She's
And
living on a boat.
the very first chapter, just from the get-go, I loved it. It just pulled me right in.
I found it, you know, a real page turner to me. I got really absorbed in it, and, you know, I'm forgiving about a lot of clunky plot parts if I like other things about the book. If I like the main character. If the main character sort of pulls me in and makes me feel like there's something going on there. And this is a really psychological kind of book, I think, and philosophical, and you know, and she is kind of in danger almost of withdrawing completely into herself and disappearing or something. And then, you know, I don't think it is an original thing, but how many things that happen to any human being are that original? I mean,
Sure.
Well, the interesting
stuff happens, and it's always, you know, human stuff.
You made a good point that her world shrinks, and then on the other hand, her world becomes global. So she goes from living on this teeny little boat to having to go across the world to Beijing to find out if this child is indeed does she have some tie to this child. So I thought that was interesting, that it went from this very small world to this very big world. I thought that was kind of an interesting.
And how they weaved in the family, the uncles that were also going to help him. He wants to enter a competition, as we know since we read the book, for the Olympics. So he had his uncles that were training him. A cooking competition. Then his uncles came in, and and you learn about the family. And through the family, I learned too about an uncle that was about to die. And they were bringing into your field of awareness about the bamboo. I had no idea.
That was fascinating.
Bamboo does not bloom for 100 years.
Wasn't that?
And when it does, it just blooms once, and then it goes away in another 100 years. And the uncle who was dying was very old, and the bamboo had never flowered in his lifetime. And then
The
bamboo-
imagery is really rich.
the bamboo does.
Really rich in this book.
Jeff, what are you bringing us right now?
This
Here we
looks
have some star
amazing.
fruit with a creamy poppy seed dressing with fresh mango and kiwi.
Yum.
You know, listen to you ladies, I got a very different perspective and approach from the book. What the book did to me reminded me of how as a culture we kind of got away from how important food was, how we used to sit together when we were younger, you know, and sit together as a family. If you notice, how many Asians do you see eating by themselves? It's very, very far and few between. It's always with somebody that they eat. And I think there was a huge emphasis on the cultural aspect, how food important was for them. You know, if we think about the good times that we've had with family and friends, we're going out partying or whatever, you're always eating and you're always drinking, and they touched upon that quite a bit throughout the book. I guess I was a little perspective different just because of the culinary end of it, and I appreciated the traditional line of how important it is in China or in Asia, how important is food to them. You know, have a lot of friends from Asian part of society, and food is so commonplace over there, so integral to their culture.
Eating isn't just something you get over with.
Right.
It's,
They're
you
not
know, in a
sharing,
hurry.
right?
Don't you think that in most older cultures, people had more time? We are in a hurry, we're rushing.
No, I think they took the time. I don't think they had it, I think they took it.
Oh, no, I don't think they had as much to do. They did not
They
have
had
the
18
diversions.
times more to do.
They had to
They
get
had
their
a
food
tent
from
to
the
fire in the
garden
house,
and wash the clothes
you
at the
know?
stream.
Okay, but those
Wash
people
tubs
weren't
and-
having, the poor
they
people
were having the rice and
were having very simple meals. We have computers, we have TVs, we have, I mean, just so many things. The past 100 years have produced a phenomenal, an electrical revolution is kind of a dumb thing to say, but we're way busier. They didn't have cars.
Yeah, but your computer doesn't make you be busy. It's something you turn to be busy.
In their
Okay.
culture, they're less superficial.
That's right. And I think
Oh, we're
the
not
idea
superficial.
Extremely superficial.
I disagree.
the idea of family comes in here because when you were talking about this and this idea of her isolation, her aloneness, and how her world is shrinking, and it was this husband who she didn't even always have a great relationship with. I mean, they were happiest when they were apart.
Right.
You know.
It was so sad.
Yes,
was-
that's a scary.
This woman is transplanted into this culture where these people that are called uncle, and I mean, I saw a lot of parallels. I have some really close friends who are Hindu and live in India, and this same kind of thing.
Sure.
You know, you're anyone you meet who your parents know and who's older than you call auntie or uncle. It's just what you
It's
do.
a different, yeah.
And that's who
different-
these uncles are. They're not uncles by blood, you know, that this chef knows. One of them is. The
Yeah,
rest of them
one of
are.
them was.
And this idea that she's transplanted into the middle of something that's so different from what she knows, and it heals her.
I was very curious what you thought of the recipes. I mean, they go into great detail about the preparation of certain food. I mean, it takes hours and hours and hours, and if it's not perfect, they throw it away. Which
Oh, that was so wasteful.
what did you think of
The only reason that's foreign to us is because we're a fast food-based society. That's the only reason why. If you go back 100 years ago in American culture and how the food was then, there was no drive-throughs or any of that sort. You did take the time to, make your pastas. It takes a long period of time. Or when you slaughter your cow, then you go through the whole process of it becoming your burger or what the case may be. So back then, there was a process. There's only technology helps expedite that significantly with the different cooking methods and the equipment that we have nowadays.
Do you think you have to enjoy food writing, like say Ruth Reichel or Anthony Bourdain or anything? Do you have to be a fan of food writing to be a fan of this book? Because there were a lot of parallels. She
Yeah.
is a food writer
Yeah.
first and
Yeah.
foremost.
Yeah.
Ruth Reichel, did some major reviews for the book online and things like that. I enjoy food writing, even if I don't enjoy the food that's being discussed.
Yeah.
I want to know what's in it. I want to know the history behind it, the cultural reasoning. I liked the book on that level, but do you have to be a fan of food writing to appreciate
No,
that?
I read one of Ruth Rachel's books and loved it. Garlic
Tender at
and
the Bone?
no,
No.
Garlic and Sapphires.
Uh-huh.
I didn't like Tender at the Bone too much. There have been other books. There was one that went on about Italian food. It was an interesting book. I found this book to be so cold.
Did you?
Very cold, very impersonal. I'm not sure how you could have found her a very sympathetic character.
I did. Very
I
much
did.
so. I felt her grief. I felt that place. She was almost emotionally dead. And I felt that about her. And I felt so much sympathy for that. You know, that this grief, I mean, that's what grief does. It brings you, I mean, it's that extreme.
It isolates you.
It brings you to a halt. I mean, and rightfully so. I mean, rightfully so. It's another thing about our culture. You know, somebody dies and you stop in for 10 minutes on your way to who knows what and say, oh, I'm sorry. I mean, grief should stop you. I mean, if it doesn't, it's going to catch up with you sometime or the other, right?
No, I disagree. I think that people do much more than stop by for 10 minutes. You know, depending on your closeness to the
Well,
deceased
sure.
and the family.
I agree with that.
I-
But
I-
it does have, it has to, you know, you have to slow down and just feel it and live in that.
Right. But
And
she
I-
was so alone. And then she went to China to this food obsessed culture. I mean, I know all of China isn't food obsessed, but the people she hooked up with were incredibly food obsessed. And then she wound up with that guy.
But I
and
think
they
there was
had
more
no-
than that. Remember when she goes to visit the uncle who's dying, and the cousins take her out to the salon, and she gets her nails done, and she gets a massage,
That's
and they're
great-
very nice
Yeah,
to her.
that was one of my favorite parts.
that
I
was
wanted
really very
to be
sweet.
there with them.
There weren't many parts like that.
That was very warm, but that, I mean, you know, that part was in it, and I thought that was very nice, and I think that did draw her out, that here she was so alone, and I think she liked the family almost as much as she liked him. I think she
did.
liked the
Oh, yeah.
concept of the family as much as she liked
It was
him.
bringing her out of her grief. It was
Right,
bringing her out of her
right.
solitude to be
Right.
around other people. And they were immediately welcoming to her. They didn't know her from...
But she didn't have to go to China to find that. There
No,
are
she
nice
didn't.
people everywhere in the world.
But she went
But
there on
she
a work
did.
assignment.
That was her story.
She went there on a work
Okay.
assignment and ended up finding that.
But
And-
to answer your question, I absolutely think, unless you are a foodie, particularly an Asian foodie, that this book is boring to tears.
But now Tina disagrees.
She does. That's
Cheryl disagrees.
Well, I am a foodie, so I
I'm a
can't. I
foodie,
can't
too.
speak for anybody who's not a foodie. I don't know. Even when you're asking about, you have to like, you know, the
Food writing.
Food writing.
Well, it's a specific type of writing.
I mean, I read cookbooks at night. You know, sit around and read them. So I'm fascinated, endlessly fascinated with the relationship between food and culture.
And do you
Food
like to
is
cook?
a way into culture. I
you
love
like
to
to-
cook. I love it, and you know, food is, and even it's this. This isn't just China that's obsessed with food.
I agree.
I mean, you go to any of the Mediterranean countries, and there's a whole lifestyle there
Absolutely.
that's focused on food and people. You know, and
Food and gathering.
Yeah.
And what I appreciated about the food, culturally speaking, in this book, were the spiritual aspects of it. That he
Yeah.
knows, he feels her grief. Sam, the chef, feels her grief, knows that she can't talk about it, because she is so caught up in herself and so
Right.
alone. And he makes her a recipe, as a specific recipe to heal grief, to draw grief out of the body.
Correct.
And I was
Love.
fascinated by that.
Well,
How-
what do you do when someone dies and you're at a funeral? You have
That's
the
it.
bereavement. You eat.
Feed them.
Right?
That's
You
right.
feed them all the time. And he thought about that, not realizing, well, he's half American or what was
Yes.
right?
Right.
So he kind of understood that aspect of it, even though he didn't expressly say, hey, I know you're grieving, you got to eat right now, but he kind of felt it trying to learn about his
Can I ask
nana.
what you would cook if you were given the task of
Man, it
feeding
really
the
would depend on
bereaved?
the person. I think
curious.
what I really enjoyed about the book is I learned. And I learned more from a chef perspective is really learning about the guest more. Typically in a restaurant, here's your menu, that's it, whoever comes in is in. You make your minor modifications, like yourself, vegetarian, right? you would say, hey, no meat in specific items, but
Not really vegetarian, but
right. But if I knew you ahead of time, if I knew you prior to that, I knew you were coming to eat, and I could feel and kind of sense you, I would create a specific dish that would be perfect for you.
Now, if you created a dish for me and I wanted Beggar's chicken, would you let a chicken run free for 2 weeks prior to you killing it and wrap it in lotus leaves
Right.
and
Buried in the mud.
buried in the mud for me to have? I'm would love to have authentic Beggar's chicken.
Well, I'll tell you
if anybody
what.
out there knows a restaurant that's serving authentic Beggar's chicken.
I'll tell you what. I wanted this man to come and cook for me. I
Sam
really
Ling.
wanted this man.
But we have Chef Jeff.
That's right.
And I said when I came in the door today, which is behind us,
Yes.
there's the man who's going to cook for me. There he is.
And I was struck by the relativity between the food and the culture because the food didn't appeal to me at all.
Right.
I keep kosher. The idea of a fatty pork dish, it was
Right.
just,
Yeah.
it was like, oh, okay. I mean, and I enjoyed reading about how they prepared it and the love and the care that went into it, but the eating of it just was like,
Many of the dishes I particularly didn't care for, but just to learn
Right.
what went into that preparation and the tradition behind
Well,
all
Tina,
of these
you
things.
mentioned something about the significance of the lotus.
Well, in a metaphysical way of speaking, the lotus flower, it grows out of the mud, this beautiful flower. So it's showing you that, out of what most people would determine as being, mud and dirty, out can come the most beautiful flower in the world.
And it's spirituality.
Yeah.
Right.
It's an unfolding too.
And
That
it opens to the
unfolding.
sun.
Who are the lotus eaters? They appeared in what famous myth?
The Iliad?
I don't know.
Was it the Iliad or the Odyssey? It was one of those,
one of
right?
those.
They were the lotus
The
eaters.
Odyssey, I think.
Was
because
it?
I think that's one of the
It's
dishes
Homer.
came upon. Yeah.
but it's also used in Egyptian art. It's a sign of abundance. The
and
lotus.
Hindu mythology.
Yes.
And it's a water lily.
And huge in Buddhism,
Touching
obviously.
on the lotus, what you
position.
said, did you feel the character, any characters in the book did that? They came from the mud, they unfolded.
She does.
Oh, very good. That was very good that you bring up a point. Yes, she does.
Right. Well, Sam does.
Very
kind of in
good
a sense,
point
too.
there. Yes.
Yeah, that's-
And Sam both did, actually.
She's living on the water after all when we first meet her, right?
Well,
And
That
he
is
connects.
very
He
true.
reconnects with his roots. He kind of grew up very secularized and Americanized, and kind of connects with
With his father, very much.
with his father. But it's very
separated
interesting.
from it.
Again, going back to the writing style, she drops the fact that the author drops the fact that his mother's Jewish. And never brings it up again. So I never understood. the point. I mean,
yeah.
I thought, well, his mother could be American and his father was Chinese. I didn't understand why she had to bring. I didn't understand why that fact was kind of just.
There's some
dropped there.
threads, I think, even with seeing that photograph and thinking that this woman she's looking for, who is the mother of her husband's child, supposedly, was actually with him when he was hit by a car. And seeing that, and then finding out, and it just doesn't seem to have any. Why is it there?
I think
Why
she's
is that
trying to
whole-
add a little suspense. The same thing.
Yeah,
The same
but
thing. The
it's
husband's
dropped.
friend. Right. The same thing. The
Did you
husband's
feel like it
friend.
was?
The husband's
Yes.
friend. They introduce
Yeah.
this character as if he has played some role. There was one other thing that I wrote. I mean, Sam is trying to get a restaurant, and at one point his backers back out. And then you never find out what
Yeah.
happens.
There's a lot of loose
There's a
threads.
lot of is kind of like. Sometimes there were a couple of scenes that I came in on, and I thought, did I miss something? Am I missing a couple of pages? I just thought she didn't give you a good tie-in to a lot of things. I felt like I was missing something.
Yeah.
Well, I think it's telling that the most that we're talking about is the food writing aspect and the cultural writing, and that's not the majority of the book. The majority of the book is Maggie's story. It's Maggie's coming out of her grief, finding herself, meeting Sam, their budding relationship that you can kind of see from like 10 miles away.
Yeah.
That's the majority of the story, but we're focusing on these aspects.
authority. I saw more the Chinese
But just
cooking
in
and
the amount
tradition.
of words. Like you'll have a full chapter on what Maggie's doing with like a small introduction from the last Chinese chef, which is the food writing. So there's like physically more of the story of Maggie and Sam. Am I saying their names right? I feel like
Yes.
Maggie and
Yes.
But when
Sam.
I
Yes.
think of this book,
But the overall aspect is
I think of the food. I don't like, to me it's the food, like the plot, 3 or 4 sentences, and really you have the plot. But the food, I mean, just goes on and on and on and on and on.
I think it's the food. I really do. I mean, the story was nice, but it was the food, the tradition, the history. And she she writes with such authority. She did her homework. She is
That's
a woman
true.
that
On
has
food culture.
30 years experience of going to China for business reasons, as well as for doing this book. But 30 years she had been going there. And
acknowledgments in the back.
yes, and she has read books that were written in 1615 about this food. I mean, she's well versed. The book is fiction, however, almost all of the ideas that are formed around the food and the cooking, they are the traditional
You would have preferred
classic.
a memoir then. I would have preferred a memoir that was written honestly. I think I would have gotten more out of it.
Except I still just love this way that Maggie's grief is presented. I really like that.
It's not typical.
The,
Right.
the
No, it was
plot
unique.
is really, it is clunky. I mean, you see, you know, as we said, that Sam relationship coming a mile away. There's no reason for all that contrived sort of thing that goes on to get her down to his family with you know, this is just all contrived. It seems contrived. But I do really feel that she has with a real, some kind of an insight, you know, gotten us into
Her
that.
writing is so spare. She exudes loneliness. Did you see
I
that
agree.
movie? Lost in Translation. It's the loneliest movie. It's solitary people. I don't know what her personal background is, but this loneliness is her thing.
Well, what I liked about it is we kind of think of Americanized Chinese food as kind of like fast food.
Yeah.
That
It
it's
is.
kind of, it's cheap.
Good point.
It's almost like fast food to us, where in the book, first of all, the culture is so civilized and so elegant, and that their idea of Chinese food is so different than anything that we in America know, and I thought that was really
I was
fascinating.
going to bring this up because I was just watching, I'm a foodie too, I was just watching Anthony Bourdain, No Reservations, because I love that show.
He's fascinating.
But he went into a Chinese restaurant in Chinatown in New York with his Chinese American friend, and he said, okay, tell me about the hidden menu. And they went in and they said, well, here's the menu that you saw growing up with your family. He's like, yeah, sweet and sour chicken, the bright orange sauce, you know, the lobster sauce that's never seen a lobster. But then there's the hidden menu for Chinese Americans and Chinese immigrants that is like real home-cooked, slow-cooked food, completely different. And because he went in with someone who knew, he got the traditional food. And it was
Get outta here.
fascinating. Fascinating.
Almost insulting.
coming up.
It is.
I don't know.
Well, let me ask you this.
You could offer
what
that
do you
to
think was the
everyone.
message she was trying to convey through the book? And did you think she achieved it partially or completely?
Great question.
Good question, Jeff. You're full
I
of
think
them
she
today, Jeff.
adores Chinese culture. She's so into that nothing else is of interest to her, and because she's so limited, she bores me.
Really?
Yeah.
See, I think it goes back to what you said earlier, she doesn't have to go there. I think she has to go there. I think she has to go to China.
What do you mean?
You said she didn't have to go to China to find the extended family and all this other thing. I think
The comfort.
Oh,
of
this
Why?
author is so in love with that culture, obviously in love with the food history, but I think she seems to experience something there. The focus of life there is different from what it is here.
Now, she
It's
was there
more
prior with her
on-
husband,
Yes.
so maybe that's why there's an emotional
You
connection,
know,
perhaps?
it's
Are we
more
talking the
on
author
the
or
author.
the character
The
now?
author, the author.
Okay.
That the focus that she probably, you know, she spent how many years in China? 30. And I think she sees something there. The focus of the culture is different from the focus of our culture. Our culture, you know, whatever the focus is, here it is the family, the extended friendships that become like family, the sharing of food. I think she really wants to convey something about
And when
the how much the soul needs that.
And when Sam brought her into the home of his uncle who was dying, which this was a very difficult time for that family, a very sacred time. And he invited her in to share in those moments when he was learning to cook some of the recipes that he was hoping he would eventually enter into the contest and win the contest. But that he brought her in at that point, I think that's what really, I think, was the catharsis in her changing, because she was a part of something so...
Crossed a line there. I mean,
She did.
that's
She crossed a
something
big line.
to be invited into a family at that kind of a time. You know,
Yes.
that's not, you don't just invite
It's a
anybody.
delicate
It is,
time.
very
She
much so.
became a part of it, and they all embraced her. She wasn't their nationality or their culture.
She didn't even speak the language.
She didn't speak the
couldn't
language,
to
but
anybody but Sam.
they loved her and they embraced her, and I thought that was...
Can we each
Nice.
give like a final summary of whether you would or would not recommend it? I think we know pretty much who would and wouldn't, but why. Just a brief, you know, summarization of what you took away from this book, what will stay with you, what won't. So we can each get our thumbs up, thumbs down. Let's start with Jeff.
If you're a foodie, I think you would enjoy learning the history of Chinese food if that's the purpose you're going into the book.
Tina.
I loved the book. I'm sure everybody kind of got that idea here today, because it makes you not look at the surface of things. And in my life, that's really what I'm all about. I don't want to just know the outer. I want to know the inner. And this really took you deep down inside something that is so very authentic, if you want, which is, I think, a very good word to say here. It's authentic, and I really took a lot from the words in the book and the traditions that I read about.
Okay, culturally, I will give you all that. On the characters, I don't think so. Like, they barely had one layer.
Well, I said it wasn't the story
Right.
either. It was
It's the book.
the book,
Okay.
the food and the tradition.
So I would not recommend this to anyone ever. If it were the last book in the universe. Maybe if someone was suffering from incredibly bad insomnia. No, I just really didn't like it. Don't like the author. Hope I never have to read her
Well,
again.
I didn't care for the last book that you loved.
Apples and oranges.
Don't make it personal.
No, that's okay.
No,
I like you.
I learned a lot about Chinese culture, and I felt like I really took something away. I learned about the difference between what China was like before the Cultural Revolution, after the Cultural Revolution, so I really felt like I learned a lot. And I learned a lot about Chinese culture, so I'll take some positive things away from the book.
I enjoyed it. I did find a lot of the points of plot that we discussed were clunky, but I can forgive that. I just got very absorbed in not only the food, but I just think there's an inextricable relationship. You can't take it apart between what's going on in this character and her grief and her transformation and the food and the culture that she finds herself in. And I felt, I'm with you, about the inner stuff, you know, that it took me into an inner experience of a character that I don't find to be really typical in a lot of novels. And it was interesting to me, but I also felt very sympathetic to her. and I just loved all the food stuff.
I pretty much agree with everything that you said, Cheryl. That's the bad part about going last, I suppose, when you're summarizing. I really enjoyed the excerpts of The Last Chinese Chef, the book that she was translating. I thought they were beautiful, beautiful passages, incredibly poetic, actually. And I wish it was kind of memoir, and I wish she stuck more with that and less of the love story. But I'm not one, I'm really picky about my love stories. I really am picky about my love stories. So that's more on me than it is on the author. I would recommend it to anybody who is interested in cuisine, in culture, in food writing, in Chinese history, related to food. I don't know that I would recommend it as just like a great sit down, tear you out of your world and run through the book fiction.
Not for everybody.
Exactly, not for everybody.
Not for everybody,
I
I
would
agree.
say, if this was a memoir, I would probably give it an A+, and if it was written just a little bit differently. But I did enjoy it. It will stay with me. I'm Andrea. We're here at Anthology New and Used Books, and thank you very much.
The authors are related to each other. Oh, I did. Yeah. Have you read it yet? I started. Okay. No, I was just trying to get in like the view. I wanted to get a jump on it, so I got it, and I started it, and it's they're an aunt and her niece, so they're really, yeah.